So I've been gone on holidays recently, and a lot of stuff happened in the news while I was gone. Obviously, not good things in any way, given that there were two mass shootings. So I'm back now. I want to talk about a little bit about everything. Specifically, I like this tweet that Trump put out, but I think Trump's reaction to this hasn't been the greatest. But anyways, I'm going to get right into it. And the tweet reads: Did George Bush ever condemn President Obama after Sandy Hook? President Obama had 32 mass shootings during his time as president. Not many people said Obama was out of control. Mass shootings were happening before the president even thought about running for president. And it's a very true statement in that there's Obama has had a higher rate of mass shootings during his presidency than Trump has. And I want to just point out that blaming the president for this kind of stuff is pretty stupid, because the president doesn't have a heck of a lot of power in stopping mass shootings. And the problem with the mass shootings is it's clearly a mental health issue, and a lot of people recognize this on both sides. I mean, no one on the far left does, but a lot of moderates, a lot of I'd say most people on the right, they recognize it's not a gun problem, it's not a racism problem or whatever the left is blaming it on now. It's a mental health thing, and a lot of people probably are baffled at, well, why aren't we more people talking about this? Why can't we get this stuff changed? And the problem for that is very simple: is that if we acknowledge that it's a mental health issue, we're going to have to acknowledge a lot of other problems in society that people don't want to acknowledge. And that if we acknowledge that it's a mental health problem, we're going to have to acknowledge the boy crisis aspect of it. And if you ever read the Boy Crisis book, it's a very good book. You should read it. If not, it's basically the idea that boys are disproportionately really struggling in society nowadays. And I think using the word disproportionately, if anything, is an understatement. And like I say, all these shootings, well, not all of them, but like 99% of them, are done by men. And if we acknowledge that it's a mental health issue, then we're going to have to acknowledge that men are being disproportionately affected nowadays. And that's not something that people want to do, because whenever men get together and talk about men's issues, even the majority of men attack them as being weird or crazy or whatever it is. I recently was listening to a podcast of mine that didn't even have anything to do with politics, and they brought up circumcision and how it's just all these crazy. Well, they didn't say it was men's rights activists but they said it's like the feminist crowd, which it clearly is, and it's more the men's rights activists. And that the tone of the whole conversation was just making fun of, like, basically, like, laughing and like, can you believe that men would get together and organize and care about men's issues? Like, it's such an issue in society nowadays, and like I just personally, I can't stand it. I don't know why we're not talking about it more. I guess I do know why we're not talking about it more, but it baffles me how people can just ignore this kind of stuff. And on top of the boy crisis thing, we'd have to acknowledge that women don't really receive the majority of the sexism nowadays. It's actually men, and it's not even close. So those are two issues in and of itself we'd have to acknowledge. We'd have to acknowledge that people are being way overprescribed drugs to deal with this mental health, or the mental health issues people are having. And that's another issue out and of itself. The politicians don't want that, because a lot of them their campaigns are probably contributed by these drug companies. Obviously, the drug companies don't want to lose their profits, so they're going to pour millions of dollars into lobbying against this kind of stuff. So that's just three issues off the top of my head that I can name, that if we're going to acknowledge that the quote-unquote mental health crisis, which is what's actually causing this kind of stuff, that we'd have to bring, the other issues would have to come up and would have to be acknowledged before, if we're going to acknowledge that. And it's not that people don't want to acknowledge the mental health part. It's the fact that people don't want to acknowledge the other issues that would have to be brought up, that I just brought up. And like I said, like, women and girls have just as much access to men. There's no law that says a woman can't own a gun that a man can't, or women have stricter regulations. It's all the same, no matter if you're a man or a woman. And women aren't going around, committing mass shootings all the time. It's men. So that's the issue that we need to be talking about. The other aspect too is that mass shootings weren't happening, 50 to 100 years ago, and gun ownership per capita was pretty much the same, and the laws, the regulations for guns was actually a lot less in a lot of ways. I mean, there were high schools that had gun clubs that people were literally bringing, pump action shotguns and, hunting rifles and all that kind of stuff to high schools, and there were no issues. Like, can you name one mass shooting that happened during this time? I mean, maybe there was one, but they were much, much less prevalent. So something has changed, and like I said, it's not the guns. It's not the guns. It's not racism, because there was more racism back. I mean, people are blaming the El Paso shooting on racism, which I think the guy clearly was a bit of a racist at the very least, but I think he definitely had some legitimate concerns, but he definitely was probably a bit of a racist. So, I mean, there was more racism back in, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, because, things like, I think Jim Crow was even still around then. Segregation was around in a lot of places then. So it's not racism, it's not the guns, so it's got to be something else. And it's how we raise kids. Society as a whole has changed nowadays, and it's changed for the worst. And the problem is we have people who have been so brainwashed into thinking that the way society is run today is a good thing, that we can't possibly acknowledge that, oh, hey, maybe this isn't a good thing. Maybe we should change things up. And this is why you constantly hear the left, especially the far left, demeaning and talking about how bad it was back in like the 1950s and 60s, because I mean, things were pretty good back then. I mean, you could have live a middle class lifestyle, with just one person working. Obviously, usually it was the man, but things were way more affordable. People got along way better. There wasn't this massive divide, and which is why, like I said, why you constantly hear the left having to berate and demean that, because if they didn't, people would recognize that, hey, it was actually pretty good back then, like for everyone, even. And housewives back then identify, I mean, they still do to this day, but back then they identify as being happier than working women nowadays, especially single women. And that the left doesn't want to tell you that, because if that happened, well, it's less votes for the left, and it's the moderates. A lot of them are brainwashed, and they kind of recognize things, but they don't fully recognize things. That they're a little woke, but they're not red pilled enough, I guess, if you want to put it that way. So I don't want to talk too much about this issue, but like I said, this is just another example of media bias, at least in this exact example, is that no one was criticizing Obama, or no one said, like, people are literally saying that the El Paso shooting was Trump's fault, and like Trump needs to disavow, the person a million times over, when the Dayton shooter literally was retweeting Elizabeth Warren, was saying he's going to vote for her, was a Democratic socialist. And where is anyone on the left saying that Elizabeth Warren needs to disavow the Dayton shooter? Like, no one's saying that. And it's just, like I said, the millionth example of media bias, and it's so predictable now that you expect it. So, at least if you're awake, and it's very disappointing, in that people, they need to politicize this stuff, and that the difference between the left and the right on this issue is the right. Yes, they have people who support them that do these kind of things, namely the El Paso shooter, but the right disavows a million times over. The left tacitly supports a lot of this stuff. You have AOC, who wouldn't condemn, and Ilhan Omar, who wouldn't condemn the person that attacked the ICE facility, that more than likely attacked it because of the concentration camp rhetoric that was being spouted by AOC. And that they don't disavow. When, like, imagine if Trump was saying that we should attack abortion facilities, and someone went and attacked one, just the outrage. But when someone attacks the ICE facility, no one cares. When the Dayton shooter was an Elizabeth Warren supporter, no one on the left cares. So it's just such massive bias nowadays that it's I mean, for someone like me, it's so easily predictable that it surprises me if it's not the case. But like I said, there's a lot of issues with this issue, but I'll leave it there. I don't want to talk too much. So if you like the video, make sure to hit that like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.